The Queen's 90th birthday 6 years ago comprised 15 working royals. These family members show up at events on behalf of the sovereign. For budgetary and pragmatic reasons, Charles has before said he intends to cut that down to just 8 senior members. Now, Camilla is Queen Consort, hence she is among those 8 automatically, though there have been many mysteries in the royal halls. Nothing equipped Princess Anne and young Prince George for what they found buried within Queen Camilla's private bedroom. What began as a harmless visit soon became a startling disclosure that has left the monarchy and people completely astonished. Was it anything far more scandalous, a coded message, or a forgotten relic? One thing is certain, this finding might completely change our understanding of Queen Camilla's position in the royal heritage. And the truth is, no more able to be buried. The British king has blessings for Prince Charles's wife Camilla to be known as Queen Consort. A regal stroll and an unimaginable revelation. What started out as a routine walk around Clarence House in early May 2025 has now evolved into a narrative capable of challenging the very foundation of the British monarchy. In recent years, the debate on a modernized, simplified royal family has become louder. Demand less senior royals, simplified responsibilities, and improved public image. Though many have embraced this change, Princess Anne, a pillar of the institution, has steadfastly opposed it. She insists that every member is absolutely vital in maintaining royal legacy, but behind closed doors, something considerably darker and far more disturbing has been discovered. Princess Anne and young Prince George found something quite unusual during what was meant to be a regular visit to Queen Camilla's quarters. Their presence wasn't meant to be disruptive. They were not seeking for secrets or probing about, but what they saw in the quiet corner of a drawer when they approached Camilla's bedroom sent the room's air to a stillness. They found an orderly, folded but aged handwritten letter from Princess Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd. This was no standard note. It was intimate, dramatic, and full of insights never before heard of in public. The letter covered Diana's last months within the royal family, her anguish, her seclusion, and her mounting isolation behind royal walls. Diana was loved by the public, but Frances described a woman suffering in quiet, floating across a society that never really accepted her anguish. The burning question is why this letter, so private, so sharp, was discovered in Queen Camilla's possession. Was it kept as a hurtful souvenir, quietly, purposefully, ignored across time? None of those responses lessens the explosive finding of this planet. Camilla's long-standing attempts to change her public persona and separate herself from the past's difficulties mean that this disclosure could force her back into the most agonizing period of the royal history. Prince George, heir to a contemporary monarchy, found this more than surprising. It was an occasion of reckoning. What lessons do the next generation bring forward as they silently observe the choices made now? For Princess Anne, who has maintained the majesty and unity of the throne, this letter questions even the oldest allegiances. We have to see Frances Shand Kidd not only as Diana's mother but also as a woman molded by aristocratic obligation and personal loss if we are to really appreciate the weight of this letter. Though her relationship with Diana was poor, this letter seemed like a last confession, perhaps even a desperate try at closure, but from personal tragedy to royal halls. Diana's mother, Frances Shand Kidd, carried concealed suffering. Watch closely to reveal the letter's hidden voyage, the silent storm hiding beneath the grin. One must first know the woman who wrote the letter, Frances Shand Kidd, to grasp the emotional depth of the one discovered in Queen Camilla's room. Born into privilege at Park House on the Sandringham estate, on January 20, 1936, Frances was not unfamiliar with royal life. She lived in the royal inner circle from her first breath. Ruth Roche, her mother, was lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Her father, Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy, was a close friend of King George V. Frances was not only a spectator of royal history, she was raised according to. Growing up in a milieu of formality and expectations, Frances carried the title the Honorable from early years. She was instructed in polite smiling, soft speaking, and never, under any circumstances, bringing personal affairs before public attention. Benevolent behind the brilliant jewels and well-polished skirts, was a young woman struggling with the weight of a life she never really chose. At just 18, Frances made news. Attended by Queen Elizabeth II personally, she married John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, at Westminster Abbey on June 1, 1954. The lavish wedding of a noble beauty to a future earl cemented Frances's place in one of Britain's most prestigious families, plastered over newspapers. Stepping into a position that carried both gloss and an unstated weight, she became the youngest woman to wed in the Abbey in half a century. Frances seemed to have it all: riches, prestige, and a future as Countess Spencer. Underneath it, though, she felt smothered by rigid policies and a frigid feeling of obligation. Then arrived Peter Shand Kidd, a rich Australian wall-covering magnate, met in 1966. He was different from everyone she had known. Charming, worldly, their link was instantaneous and deadly. 1967 saw Frances do the unimaginable. She broke the picture of the compliant, aristocratic lady by divorcing her husband. Her choice made news and stunned the establishment in a period when divorce, especially among the upper class, was still forbidden. With 4 small children, one of them Diana, the public and media put their attention on her, not with pity but with investigation. The intense custody dispute that developed was not the freedom Frances had envisioned. It transformed her suffering into a national show, creating marks her children would carry for decades, the never-healed wound. But the price of Frances Shand Kidd's revolt did not finish with court headlines or public humiliation. It descended into a child's delicate heart. Frances thought she was fleeing a life that imprisoned her when she left the Spencer family house in 1967. She had no idea how that choice would split her daughter Diana's life apart. During a dramatic custody dispute before the London Family Division Court in 1969, the betrayal became very much underlined. Unexpectedly, Frances's mother, Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, testified against her daughter, turning what was already a very intimate family split into a terrible public wound. Ruth said John Spencer was the more consistent and competent dad. The courtroom environment apparently became chaotic and tense. The treachery sounds more loudly than any guess. John Spencer won before the judge. Full custody of all 4 of his children, Sarah, Jane, Charles, and Diana, was given to him, along with her marriage, social status, and now her children. Frances lost everything. For Diana, who was just 6 years old at the time, it was a heartache she cannot comprehend. Her mother was softly stroking her hair one day, while she was tucking her in, and then she vanished. Not a warning, not a justification a youngster could understand. Diana would bear that scar all her life. It permeated her sense of self-worth, her mental health, and her relationships. Years later, she would tell friends, "She left me, and it felt like." Diana would be the public princess, but behind the palace gates, she stayed a woman trying to believe she was really loved. Diana loved her father, but she yearned for a mother's warmth, something she felt had been snatched from her. There was conflict, a strange mix of love, bitterness, and silent anguish every time Frances returned into her life. Every interaction they had was flavored by history that neither could completely eradicate. Diana yearned for intimacy, but the distance left by years of absence never really closed. Another hit followed. John Spencer wed gorgeous, sharp-tongued socialite Countess of Dartmouth, daughter of romantic author Barbara Cartland, in 1976. Then a teenage girl, Diana, squared up angrily with her new stepmother. She apparently phoned her acid rain, a barb at her alleged coldness and disengagement. Diana felt even more pushed away with this fresh presence in her father's house. The place where she kept her early memories suddenly seemed alien and hostile. Frances's second marriage was collapsing in meantime. Her relationship with Peter Shand Kidd had become irreversibly damaged by 1988. Once more left behind was the lady who had dared all for love. But when a mother loses her children to divorce, only to see one become the future queen, what then? A royal daughter, a silent divide. The breaking down of Frances Shand's second marriage to Kidd left her alone once more. But fate had one last turnabout. Her daughter Diana, now 19, started courting Prince Charles, the heir to the British monarchy, in February 1981. Frances was practically thrown back into the public view she had long sought to avoid overnight. The same nobility that had gently turned her aside now turned back toward her, this time as the mother of England's future queen. It was an odd sort of justice, tinged with emotional detachment and irony. For Frances, it was once lost to court orders and icy tradition. The child she had was now set to dominate the very system that had rejected them both. But under the fairy tale story that the public was presented, the reality remained far more complex. Once split, the mother-daughter relationship never healed entirely. Though Frances went to the royal wedding on July 29, Paul's Cathedral, sat amid officials and nobility, she was more a guest than a mother, observing from a distance as Diana was swept into a life of palaces, conventions and pressure. Frances could see traces of her own life in her daughter's suffering. When Diana's marriage started to break apart from a partner, emotional coldness, the weight of public expectation, and the isolating character of royal existence. Unlike Frances, Diana stayed behind though. She stayed for her boys, Prince William and Prince Harry, and for optimism that things would improve rather than for herself. Not always is what I read. People want to tell me that. Frances stayed on the outside while Diana was riding emotional storms. Their touch was scarce. Years of untold suffering and different decisions harmed their relationship. Following Diana's extremely public divorce from Prince Charles in 1997, Frances conducted an interview with Hello newspaper. She said in it, Diana felt relief at renouncing her Royal Highness title, but Diana felt deceived once more rather than understood. That one comment destroyed the brittle relationship they had left. Furious and terribly damaged, Diana never spoke to her mother once more. The silence continued unbroken, until disaster happened. Diana died in a Paris automobile accident on August. Although the loss was great, for Frances it had even more keen edges. Only quiet. No last chat. No settlement had been had. Overwhelmed with loss and remorse, Frances sent a handwritten statement thanking the people for their compassion. She wrote in it with shaky elegance, pride, love and admiration. I restore her to him so she might rest in peace. When another royal upheaval started to develop, one grounded not in the past but in the always complex present, the melancholy parting of Frances had hardly settled into memory. Over a straightforward lunchtime visit at Clarence House, everything began softly, almost too gently. Always clear-eyed and duty-bound, Princess Anne came with intent. Though Anne had an unquestionable relationship with her brother, King Charles V, she had started to notice the minute changes in the palace walls, Camilla's growing power, her increasingly private activities, and above all the rising concern about Charles' health, murmured but never confirmed in recent months. Citing tiredness and need for repose, the king had started withdrawing from several royal responsibilities. Camilla had grown more apparent, more forceful, more decisive in his place. Some would say she was more powerful, though Anne, who had seen enough palace changes in her life to know when anything seemed off, wasn't convinced. To outsiders it seemed like a smooth transition. When Queen Camilla started calling off public events due to tiredness, Anne felt alarmed bells ring. She didn't trust readily, and she most certainly didn't leave issues unresolved about the throne. Early spring on a cold Saturday afternoon, Anne chose to visit Camilla's private apartments without official notice at Windsor. She was not on her alone. Young Prince George, aged 11, accompanied her. He had stayed under Anne's wing during the weekend. The two had become somewhat close by accident. Curious and intelligent above his years, George thought Anne's candor was pleasant. She recognized in George the ingredients of a king who could one day have to grasp ideas not included in historical accounts. The chambers of Camilla seemed to be very quiet, for someone who is known to keep her space open and casual. The locked doors and drawn curtains felt strange. Hesitantly but prodded by Anne's steady voice, a chambermaid divulged that Queen Camilla had gone earlier that morning for her own estate, Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, and without her regular staff. People started to wonder about this. Camilla's hideaway from formal royal residences has always been Ray Mill House, but leaving so quickly without even a letter left behind was not like her. The silence within Clarence House, particularly in Camilla's portion, was not only spooky, it came pretty natural. Anne and George exchanged glances, each seeing something more expansive developing. Though the palace might have been silent, the weight of something unspoken permeated the air. Hidden behind the walls of a chamber not touched since Camilla's unexpected death
What they were about to discover would cause a revelation, neither of which either of them had expected. But what did Princess Anne and Prince George find in the deserted room of Queen Camilla that rocked the quiet of the palace? This affects everything. Get ready, the chest is it. That time-lost memory. Princess Anne's instinct sharpened as the still moment lingered inside Queen Camilla's empty rooms. Undoubtedly, something was wrong. The silence was not like others. It was sealed off and unspoiled. The space lacked the warmth or everyday rhythm one would find in an occupied royal suite. There were not fresh-cut flowers on the table, on the windowsills. There were not half-finished teacups. The air was just faintly lavender, and even that seemed to linger from another era. Reluctant to let the unusual sensation pass, Anne called the royal steward. Few would wonder, with a nod of authority, she called for the master key. Anne unlocked the chamber door herself as second-born, but never second in command when it came to settling things. She entered cautiously, young Prince George behind closely, his calm curiosity of someone too young to know what to expect, but old enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The silence in the room was almost theatrical. Velvet curtains tightly closed, the light hardly visible. Then George saw something. A big old trunk locked by a faded brass clasp, behind a fading dressing screen at the far side. Time discolored the wood, and dust had settled on the top. Still the faint engraving glowed through. He examined more closely. Enlarging eyes. "DS," he mumbled aloud. Diana Spencer's breath caught. "George, step back," she said firmly, her voice steady but she moved purposefully toward the trunk, removed a pair of lace gloves from Camilla's vanity, then handled the antique latch. The trunk creased softly and opened. Inside, time stopped. There, folded and kept as though waiting to be uncovered, were hundreds of very intimate objects that hadn't seen use since Princess Diana's terrible death in 19. Letters in her flowing, emotive handwriting, secret journals full of ideas too raw for public access, black and white images, capturing unscripted events, laughing with her sons, gazing out from palace windows, even solo walks, suggesting a softer, unseen life. Along with mementos, there were pressed flowers in a book, a ballet program with messages in the margins, and a small music box kept running a faint lullaby when opened. Anne delicately pulled out one envelope with yellowed edges, sealed with a wax crest. She didn't open it, not now. George remained quiet, knowing intuitively that this was more than simply history. It was a secret aspect of his family's history that Camilla's room was never supposed to uncover. Sounds from the past. Anne remained stationary. The air surrounding her seemed thick with past, laden with questions nobody had ever dared to raise openly. Still a few steps behind her, Prince George examined her face attentively, as if attempting to interpret the storm of ideas building behind her steady gaze. Among the well-kept letters, one sat somewhat aside, folded with a strange eagerness. George scooped it up gently. The handwriting was definitely Diana's. The words directed to my sons should something ever happen to me. It struck with such weight like a cold down the spine. This was not any regular letter. This was a warning encased in love. A frantic attempt to span time. Anne kept reading, bringing out another note. "Pleasure of sitting next to you earlier. I assumed you might have chosen to go somewhere else knowing what was written in red ink. A clear indication of significance. It dated just months before the deadly disaster in Paris in August 1997. This one, meant for Queen Elizabeth II, was quite intimate, but tinged with concern. Diana described seeing a shadow always following her, and felt watched. Of hearing clicks on her phone line. She admitted she might never live long enough to watch William and Harry flourish into men. She was afraid. Her sentences were rife with anxiety and need. Anne's fingers tightened. If these letters were authentic, if these were Diana's last thoughts, then how had they found themselves in Camilla's private quarter? The finding was all the more unsettling as there was no official archive sticker, no protective box, no royal seal, only raw, exposed bits of a lady who had suffered alone. There were few and dubious possibilities. Had Camilla taken them in the turmoil after Diana's death, back when her personal items were rapidly hauled from Kensington Palace, during a time of uncertainty, grief and unresolved issues? Or worse, had someone from Diana's orbit passed them on voluntarily, maybe even Charles itself? The idea stayed uncomfortably with Anne. Haunted by remorse and driven to make peace with the past, Charles could have thought Camilla deserved to see Diana's truth. But handing her these letters meant for her mother-in-law would have seemed like crossing a line too holy to touch. And if they were meant to be preserved, why had Camilla locked them in a separate room, unspoken about, not kept with care or handed to the royal archives? And why had she left so suddenly, deserting them like abandoned luggage after all this time? Turning to George, Anne spoke softly. She remarked, "These were not supposed to be lost." The question still hung in the air, sharp and unanswered. Again, who had deceived Diana? But in Queen Camilla's covert chamber, what secrets did Princess Anne and Prince George find? And who again really turned on Diana? Maybe the truth surprises everyone more than they could have ever dreamed. The picture that yelled louder than quiet. The room stayed still as though the walls themselves were listening. Anne descended farther inside the ancient chest, her fingers caressing a firmly wrapped faded manila envelope. Private. The words "do not open," eyes just printed across it in fading black ink. Her pulse hammered. Her instincts sharpened. She unfastened the seal without saying. Prince George stood close now, eyes wide and alert, the weight of inheritance beginning to slowly show on his youthful face. Inside were pictures the public has never seen. Diana snaps of barefoot in the grass, carefree and brilliant, laughing with William and Harry at the Highgrove garden. But one picture set Anne's hands shaking. It was taken only a few weeks before August 31, 1997, Diana's terrible death in Paris. She stood in a Clarence House corridor by herself. Her eyes were hollow nearly, her grin gone. Beside her another woman stood half cropped out, her arm clearly sporting a gold bracelet, the one Camilla had worn for many years. The breath of Anne caught. Camilla was where she was working. Had they convened behind closed doors? What, if anything, passed between them? She looked to George, whose face was pallid. Why would Queen Camilla have kept these? He inquired gently. Anne answered nothing. Nobody else living in the palace either. Later that day, Windsor's quiet settled over her cracked like glass. Word made it to King Charles. Camilla was called silent. Only a hushed storm behind closed doors. No formal statement, no broadcast apologies. Insiders spoke of a harsh conversation between Anne and her brother. She insisted on learning the reason the contents had been kept secret for so long. When Camilla answered, her voice apparently trembled. "I retained them out of anxiety. I never brought them to hurt anyone. I wanted calm and to know her. Maybe peace." To Anne and many others, however, it felt like possession, and that line as well had been startled. Prince William requested that every item go back to her estate. Harry reportedly said nothing at all, advised by Anne from far off, but his quiet spoke a lot. As was expected, the press exploded. Headlines screaming, "Diana's secret diaries discovered in Camilla's chamber. Princess Anne reveals royal truth." The response from the people was quick. Old doubts regarding Camilla's involvement in Diana's life and legacy were rekindled. Once more sympathy flooded for the lady, many still referred to as the people's princess. Diana's words, ideas and most inner scars have come back, once buried in books. Her suffering now permeated the palace, ever tenacious. Anne resolved, would not end in silence once more. Plans started to silently take shape. With William's permission, certain letters could eventually be published for public view. Diana's voice deserved to be heard once more worldwide. One thing, nevertheless, stayed obvious in the middle of all. Not destroyed had been it had just been hidden, till a lad and his great-aunt uncovered a chest that defied closure. Still, what more do you suppose Queen Camilla was hiding in that guarded chest? And why had Diana's last picture with her kept under wraps for so long? We would like your opinion. Remember to comment below and subscribe as well.